Hey, how's it going? And today we are looking at advanced utility editor widgets, and I'm doing this because I've come to understand the importance of these utility widgets, that you can program them to do all kinds of things. But in order to program them or interact with them, you need a user interface, a user widget. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on, is creating a utility widget. And I found these extremely finicky and difficult to get my mind around. And one of the things that we're going to be doing to do this is we're going to be creating a reusable button widget, and that creates its own little set of problems. So one of the things is that when we create a reusable button, we lose its functionality and we have to do some workarounds. And that was one of the hardest things for me to get my mind around. For example, in this case, the hover functionality of the button is going to be replaced by a property bind to a color property of an image. So you'll see this as we go, and I'll do my best to explain it as we can. This might be a little longer than usual, maybe a half hour, because there's quite a few concepts to cover. But we're essentially just creating two blueprints. One is going to be a user widget and the other is going to be a utility widget blueprint. So let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to make the button first. And this is its own little can of worms. So for this, we're just going to right click and go to user interface, widget blueprint, user widget, and we'll just call this BP underscore button. And this is how you would create a reusable button just for a regular user widget too. For this, there are just 4 things that we need. So let me go ahead and double click into this, and I'll dock this up top, and I'll get all the things first, and then we'll kind of go over each one. So the first one is a canvas panel. The second is an image. The third is some text, and just drag that on the canvas panel. And the last one is a button. So there's our 4 things. There's nothing we need to do with the canvas panel. We're good on that. The image, what we want to do is make it full screen, and so we have to zero out all these values here. And then we're going to, on its color and opacity, we're going to drop it down to just 0.1. Like that, so we can kind of see through it. I'm just going to call this hover image. And then on the text block, we're just going to call this button text. This is not a variable, interesting. We're going to leave it that size. On the anchors, I've done tutorials about this. We're going to open this up, hold down Control and click in the center. Come back in there and hold down Shift and click in the center, and now it's perfectly aligned. And we'll go size to content. So that takes care of that. I don't think there's anything we're going to do on the text just yet. We're going to do a bind, what they call a property binding, to change that later. The last thing is on the button itself, we're going to come up here to anchors and make it full screen. And again, we're going to zero out these offsets, so it takes over the whole screen. And on its background color, we're just going to change it to 0. We just want the button functionality, the on-click functionality. That we don't want anything else really from the button. The button may not like that, but that's all we need it for. And now here, I'm just going to call this main button. You know what? I'm just going to call it my main button, just so we know that we created it. I'm getting in the habit of getting away from the full screen, just because the fill screen, because I think it's misleading, and I'm just going to put it to desired. And this is really what we're looking at dealing with. So I just think it's clearer that way. Now, as I mentioned, because we're going to be using this inside of a widget blueprint, we're going to lose a lot of its functionality. So we have to figure out a way to restore that functionality. And that's what I didn't understand that for the longest time. And that's why I wasn't doing a lot of reuse of widgets, user created widgets. So the first thing we want to do is actually create some hover functionality, because we're going to lose that button functionality. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the graph here, and we just have 2 variables right now. And the first one is called main button and the hover image, but we need 4 more variables, and so let's just go ahead and make those right now. So the first one is going to be a color variable, and that's a linear color. So we'll just search for linear color, right there, and we can make that public and instance editable. Then we're going to need a string variable, and we'll just call it string text. You can call these whatever you want to call them. These are just what I'm calling them. And then we just need two booleans. And I want to show you something very interesting about a boolean, and I didn't really realize this, but it's very, very interesting. If we put a lowercase b there, and I'm just going to, on here, I'm just going to put in clicked with the question mark. And that's going to be a boolean. And these all need to be instance editable. And I'll hit Control D and duplicate this. And this one is going to be called B is active, question mark. And what we'll see is that when we pull this node out with that lowercase, we're not going to see that lowercase b. We're just going to see clicked. And I never really knew that. So with all these four variables created, we also are going to create two functions. And we'll get to those in just a minute here. So the first thing I want to do is create our onHovered functionality. And instead of the button doing that, we're going to use the image to do that. So we're going to go to my button here. We're going to click on hovered, go back to my button, and click on hovered again. And then we're going to go ahead and get that color. And we'll go set color, and we'll go Control D because we're going to do it twice. And then we're going to get a branch node, so just press down B and click, and we need two of these. So there we go with that. One of our buttons is already going to be on, and then to turn that button off, it's like a panel of buttons. Like if you can imagine, if you can only have one button pressed at a time. You can't have two buttons pressed. So like if you have three buttons, only one can be down at a time. That's the functionality that we're creating. So it's a little weird programming this because it seems counterintuitive what we're doing. So, but what we're doing here is basically saying if the button is clicked, don't do any hovered functionality on that button. So that's what this is doing right here. Compile and save. This by default is just set to false. So what we'll do is we'll drag this here and we're just going to plug it in as our condition. So if it's true that the button is clicked, don't do anything. Otherwise, change the color of the buttons. Now these are our hovered colors here. So on hovered here, we're just going to set this to white, and we'll just go ahead and make this like, let's say 0.7 or something like that. For the unhovered color, which is essentially the normal color of our button, we'll just make it like a 0.3. So our unhovered color is essentially the normal color of our button. So we're just going to plug this in here and this in here, and then the false goes in here, not the true. Because if the button's clicked, if someone's clicked the button down, then we want to remove this onHovered functionality. And as soon as the button is unclicked, then we'll put it back to its hoverable state. It took me a while to get my mind around this. So there's that. But now we have our unhovered and hovered functionality for our buttons. But see how we had to create it on our own. Now there's just one more. Oh, there's one other part to this. So what's actually going to be changing colors is our image. So we have to come to image, and here where it says color and opacity, we bind it to our color. Like that. So we're going to have three buttons, and one of them is going to be pressed down to begin with. So to set that all up, that logic, we're going to come over here to where it says is active, meaning that it's been pressed, and we'll get it. And see, notice how it doesn't show that lower B any. It just says is active, even though it says B over here. So that's a little interesting thing. Now if I hit B and click, now we can put this logic in right here. And this also is set to false initially. And this is a straight true or false thing. Now the only issue is we don't have any clicked functionality yet, or what, not really click, but set functionality. So we need to set our button in a kind of a press state and an unpressed state. So here what we're going to do is we're going to create two functions. I'm going to come over here and click that button there, And I'm going to call, oops, I'll call this pressed state there. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and if it's pressed, then we want to go ahead and mark it that it's been pressed or clicked. So this is going to be, we're going to set it that it's been pressed, and then this will tell our hover functionality to stop because it's been clicked. And then here we can set it to a color showing that it has been clicked. So we can get our color here and go set color, and I don't know what color, it could be any color, but I don't want to make it completely white because the text is white, so maybe I'll just give it a reddish, a greenish hue if it's been set, it's pressed. So that'll be that. And then there's also we'll get our main button here, and what we want to do here is once the button's been pressed, we want to disable it. So here we're just going to go set is enabled right here, and we'll plug this in like that right there. So if it's pressed, we want to mark it that it's been pressed, and then change the color to green, and then we want to disable it. So I can just copy this here and go Control C, and we're going to create another function here, and I'm going to call this unpressed state here. And then I can just go Control V and paste this in here. Now the color that we want it to be here is essentially back to our unhovered color, because that's our normal state. So we want to put it back to that color, which I believe was white with 0.3, like that. And so that's our unhovered state color, and we want to put it back. And then we want to do the reverse. Then we want to mark it. We want to mark it that it's not clicked anymore or pressed. And then we want to enable it again, so it's back in the game. So that's the functionality that we need. And then the last thing that we need to do on here, and this is just for our button, it's hard to believe, right, is we come into the designer view here, and on our text we want to do what we did with the image, except here we want to bind it to the text here, so that way we can update it. And as far as I know, I hope I didn't miss anything, but that should be it for our reusable button. This is probably why you don't see too many tutorials about this, because it is a little bit involved, and you do have to put your thinking cap on, because you're creating all of this functionality on your own. Now, one last thing is back here, I'm glad I came back here, is that we can call those functions now. So here on true, it's going to be pressed, right? So we're going to call pressed here, and then here we're going to call unpressed. And that is that. So as far as I know, that is the whole thing. So, and it's quite a bit just to do the button. So now what we're going to do is we're going to jump into creating our utility widget. What we're going to do is we're going to right click, go to utility widget here, and open this up, and we'll just go select, and I'll just leave it called what it is, and we're just going to grab a canvas panel and drag this onto the scene here. Here's the great thing that's really cool, is now I can just go and get those buttons, that VP button that we made, and I need 3 of them, so I'm just going to drag that onto the scene, and then I'll just go Control D and Control D. And before I go too far, I'm going to go ahead and rename them. So this is going to be BP button 1. This is going to be BP button 2. And then this is going to be BP button 3. And then what I can do is just, I hope I can grab these. Let's see what I can grab here. That's button 3. That's button 2. And I'm just going to put them right over here. just like that. And you can, of course, format these any way that you want. Now I can select them all. Here they look like they're a little out of order, but we can size them to content and just have our buttons there. So that's button 1, button 2, and button 3. So they're in order, although they seem out of order over there. And they're all variables. And then I'm just also going to get some text here. So, and I'll just drag this on right here. And I'm not really adding any functionality to this. I'm just going to call this display text. So we're going to, the only thing these buttons are going to do is you'll see them change, and they'll change this display right here. But the point of this is to create the interface, and once you have the interface created, then you can use it to create any other functionality that you want, whether you want to spawn something into your game or your project or whatever you want to do. The first thing that I want to do is create a function. So I'm going to jump over into the graph here because I need a function to call. And this is going to do the lion's share of our work here. And this is all going to, so I just come up here to function, and I'm just going to call this switch button, like that. And off of here on this, it's going to take in a string value. So we'll just type in here a string, and let me pull this out here a little bit, and it'll be a string. That's all we need for right now on here, just so that we can call it from our event graph. And then if we go into the event graph here, you can see that I just have to set up a sequence to call these buttons. This part of it is really, really interesting to me. So I'm going to just delete these nodes here. I'm going to press S and get a sequence node. And I'm just doing it this way because it's going to get really cluttered when we bind to all these events. So we have our 3 buttons here. So I'm going to just drag one on to start with. And what's interesting is this is a child of this parent over here. So what we can actually do is call, if I drag off of here, I can actually call for the main button and get my main button, which is really interesting. I wasn't aware that we could even do that. So that's really, really interesting. And if I pull off of here, I have access to the functionality on that button. So I can go assign on clicked, even though I'm calling from the child. So here, this is why I say it starts getting kind of messy, a little messy here. But I'm going to drag that into there. And then I'm just going to call that function, that switch button. So we'll call switch button right here. And there it is right there. And here, I'm going to write in, I'm just going to write in button 1. That's all I'm going to type in right there. Okay, now we just have to redo this. So 2 more times for the other buttons. So that's why I say it starts getting a little messy. So we're going to get this button here, button 2, and we'll call to my main button. That's why I want to call it my main button. And then off of here, we can go assign on clicked. And so what we're doing is we're accessing the on clicked functionality of our parent widget, which is really pretty interesting and cool. And then again, off of this event here, we're just going to call that switch function. And that's the last thing that we have to do here is build out that functionality. So we're just setting up to call it, and then we'll go in there and finish up this whole thing. So there's that. And now for this last one, we got to just do the same thing, get button 3 and drag off of here, and we'll get my main button right there, and we'll go assign again and assign on clicked here, and we just got to drag this wire down here. It's getting a little messy again. I'm just going to throw a reroute node in here. I had more time, I come and kind of make this a lot neater. And there's that. And then again, I can just click here and go Control D. And so each one of our buttons will be able to make its own distinct call to that function when it's clicked. So that's all that we have to do here. I'm just double checking, make sure I've got everything wired up. And like I said, I should clean that up. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. Now, this is the last thing that we need to do. And here, it's essentially we're resetting everything. So if I come in here to switch button, we have our string value here. I can actually create a string value here. So let me just create a string value. Go F2, and I'm just going to call this my string here, and it's a string. So we have this variable here. I'll just go ahead and make it instance editable. By default, it doesn't have a name or anything. It's not set to any value. By default, we do want to set a button. So we could, if we want, set a value to this string if we want, and we could just set it to button 1, but you'll see that we're going to set that anyway. But I'll just call it button 1 for right now. And what we're going to do then is we're going to drag this off here and set this. So we're just going to plug this in here like this, and this in here like that. And then we're going to get a sequence node, press S and get a sequence node. And here's where we do the switching with our buttons, right? So when it gets the function call, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to unpress all of the buttons. So we're going to get a reference to all of our buttons here. Button 1, button 2, and button 3. And then off of here, we're going to search for unpressed. So unpressed here, and then I can just go Control D and Control D here, and we're just going to plug all of this into here and just wire all this up like this. So this essentially clears out all of our buttons. But then based on the button that's selected, then this is the last thing that we need to do, is we're going to pull off of here, from here, and we're going to go switch on string right here, and we're going to go ahead and add some pins, and we have 3 array elements here, and this is going to be button 1, this is going to be button 2, and this is going to be button 3, like that. So we have our 3 conditions, and then for depending on which button is pressed, so this is going to go into here, then that button will go into the press state, and the other buttons will all be released from the press state. So from here we do kind of what we just did. I'm going to drag these 3 buttons on here, again references to each button here like that, and then this is the 3rd one here like that, and then we're just going to call that pressed button state. So pressed state right there, and then we're just going to go Control D here, and so this is going to essentially be our logic for how we know which button was pressed, and each button will have its own function. And from here you could create other functions to do all kinds of different things. I mean, this can get really incredibly complex, and you would create just other functions that you could call from here that would do other things and call other functions. So the last thing that we're going to do is get our text block. It doesn't look like I set that to a variable, so we come here. I didn't set it as a variable. Compile and save that. And this is the very last thing that we have to do, is I'm going to get that text block here, drag it off here, and this is where you could program in other function calls or the things to be spawned in or wherever, because we know at this point that the individual button has been pressed. So we could program those buttons to do different things. And we could put that logic in here or put function calls in from here. So all we're going to do here is just set the text, set text right here. And I'm just doing something real quick and simple. You can't print out a string. Okay, so here we're just going to write you pressed button 1. That's all we're going to do. So you know that that button was pressed. And then here, I'm just going to select that, marquee select, and go Control D and Control D, and plug this in here. Whoops. And plug this in here. And then we'll just change this wording to you press button 2 and you press button 3. And the last thing I think we need to do is, let me go back into the designer view here, and button 1. You'll see these are the parameters that we set. So here I can just put in here, type in button 1, and here for button 2 I can type in button 2, and then for here I can type in button 3, like that. And then here you'll see we have these our options that we programmed in. I can compile and save that. I want to set the first button as already active. So you'll notice when I do that, because of the logic, they both come on. So that should be it. That's the whole thing. And if I come in here, and I can come up to tools, and I can go to, well, I don't see it yet, so I think I have to warm it up. The widgets are a little weird, so, but if I click here, I can go run utility widget, and you'll see there's our buttons, and you'll see how we have our hover functionality, but that's actually just our image. But watch, if I click this, that button goes off. These buttons have hover functionality. This button goes off. And then look, if I pull this out here, you'll see the logic that we programmed in. You press button 1, button 2, button 3. But ideally what this would do is you'd press this button and it could do all kinds of mayhem and cause all kinds of things to happen. You could spawn in 10,000 soldiers, or you could spawn in 100 cameras, or you could move the directional light, or you could just do anything. But in order to do that, you need an interface, and this is one way. Now, I didn't have to use a reusable button, but I think that you'll find that you should get in the habit of reusing your widgets. And if you do, I think it'll work out a lot better for you in the long run. It'll save time. And then if later I decide I want to make a change to one of these buttons, I can just go into the one button blueprint here and make that change there. I don't have to make it anywhere. I don't have to make it on each single button. So anyway, that's all I had today. I feel like I've been talking for 20 hours, but anyway, I do appreciate you checking it out, and I hope you found this helpful.